Marine mocked a quiet woman at a VFW bar. Iron Valor made him stand and salute. He laughed at her, said she'd never worn a uniform, never seen a real fight, never done anything for the country she claimed to love. But when she spoke two quiet words across that smoky VFW bar, the room fell silent. Every man stood up, and the young Marine who mocked her realized he had just insulted one of America's most decorated war heroes. Want to know what Iron Valor means and why that night changed everything? Hit subscribe, tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin. Rain fell in thin silver sheets over the quiet streets of rural Texas, tapping against rusted pickup hoods parked outside Post 142. The neon glow of a faded beer sign buzzed in the window, its red, white, and blue light reflecting on puddles like a muted flag. Inside, the warmth of bourbon breath and slow country guitar wrapped around a room of men who had once worn the uniform. Stories of faraway sand and jungle nights drifted like smoke through the dim barlight, carrying both pride and pain. Faded flags lined the wood-paneled walls, each one folded and framed with solemn care, each one representing a life remembered. The scent of barbecue grease and old leather clung to the air, stubborn as the memories the men carried. Boots scraped against sawdust-scattered floors while laughter rose and fell beneath the clinking of whiskey glasses. This was their sanctuary, a place where the past wasn't explained, only understood. At a corner table near the jukebox sat Jake Tanner, a former Marine with the kind of loud confidence that made heads turn. His stories grew taller with every sip, each retelling polishing his image as a hardened warrior. The younger veterans leaned in, eager for proof that they too belonged to the brotherhood forged in fire. To them, Jake was the embodiment of what service looked like, brash, bold, and unashamed. Across the room, unnoticed by most, sat Sarah Whitaker. She was dressed plainly, jeans, boots, a soft gray sweater, and nursed a single beer with quiet detachment. Her eyes moved slowly over the room, cataloging faces, patches, and the easy camaraderie she never quite felt part of anymore. To anyone else, she was just another civilian enjoying a drink on a Friday night. What no one saw was the weight beneath her calm. Years of service had carved deep grooves in her memory, some filled with pride, others with ghosts she would rather forget. She had once led men into battle and brought them home alive. Now she preferred silence to stories and anonymity to applause. Post 142 was not a stage for glory. It was the only place she could disappear. The chatter swelled as more veterans arrived, shaking hands and swapping jokes only they understood. Laughter echoed against the walls, though beneath it pulsed a quieter rhythm, the shared ache of lives forever changed. Some bore scars that showed, others carried wounds no one could see. But all had come here for the same reason, to be among those who understood without words. The bartender, Tom Delaney, watched it all from behind the worn oak counter. His silver hair and measured smile betrayed decades of stories he never told. He knew the faces, the bravado, the way silence often said more than speeches. And though he nodded along to Jake's tales, his gaze lingered longer on the woman alone in the corner. The jukebox switched to a Toby Keith ballad, and a few old-timers raised their glasses toward the stars and stripes hanging over the bar. Patriotism ran thick here, not the kind shouted in rallies, but the kind etched into bones and blood. They toasted the fallen, the forgotten, and the ones who still woke at night, thinking they were under fire. Jake's voice rose above the music, pulling the room's attention back to his stories. "That's when I knew," he boomed, chest puffed out. "Real Americans prove themselves where it counts, under fire." His words earned approving nods and claps on the back. To many, it was just another story. To Sarah, it was a reminder of why she stopped telling hers. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft and relentless, washing the town's quiet streets clean. Inside, the night stretched on, a celebration of service, sacrifice, and survival. But for one woman sitting alone by the jukebox, it was also a test. And though no one knew it yet, the truth she carried would change everything before the night was over. Sarah stared into the amber depths of her glass, watching tiny bubbles rise and burst against the surface. The sound of laughter and war stories faded into a low hum, distant and unimportant. She had come here to mark the end of a chapter, the completion of her master's thesis on post-combat reintegration, not to become part of anyone's story. For years she had been content to be invisible. Her life now was a deliberate act of distance. Mornings spent buried in research at the university library, afternoons volunteering at a veterans support group, helping others find words for wounds they couldn't name. Nights like this one, spent in places that felt familiar but never quite like home. The world saw her as a quiet academic. Only a handful of people knew she had once worn a uniform few even knew existed. There were nights when the past crept closer than she liked, when the weight of decisions made half a world away, pressed down on her chest. The names of the men she saved, and the ones she couldn't, echoed in dreams that woke her before dawn. No medal or mission report could balance that ledger. Silence was the only armor she trusted anymore. She had tried once to speak about it, at a campus panel on veterans' experiences. The polite applause and empty platitudes that followed had taught her everything she needed to know. Most people didn't want the truth. They wanted tidy stories of bravery that fit neatly into speeches and social media posts. The reality, the fear, the blood, the impossible choices made them uncomfortable. Here at Post 142, the silence felt different. It wasn't born of ignorance, but understanding. The men who gathered around whiskey-stained tables knew the cost of service too well. They carried it in the tremor of a hand reaching for a glass, in the pause before a punchline. And so she came here not for company, but for the comfort of shared quiet. Tom slid a fresh beer onto the counter without a word, and Sarah offered a faint smile in return. He didn't ask questions, he never did, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, that made her wonder if he knew more than he let on. It wouldn't have surprised her. Men like Tom had a way of seeing past the surface. At the other end of the bar, Jake's stories grew louder, bolder, more theatrical. Every boast was a shield against the uncertainty he carried inside. Sarah recognized the performance. She had seen the same act in countless young soldiers trying to outrun their doubts. Once she had even been one of them. But that part of her life was over. The missions, the classified briefings, the impossible odds, all of it belonged to a past she had buried. Now she was just Sarah Whitaker, graduate student, volunteer, and quiet observer of a world that often mistook noise for strength. And for the most part, she was at peace with that. Still, there were nights like this when the silence felt heavier than usual. When she caught her reflection in the bar mirror and saw not the woman she had become, but the soldier she once was. And when that happened, the line between past and present blurred until she wasn't sure which one she was really living in. The rain outside turned from a drizzle to a downpour, its steady rhythm syncing with the pulse in Sarah's chest. She took a slow breath and let the moment wash over her. The warmth of the room, the hum of conversation, the faint ache that never fully went away. Tonight was supposed to be about peace. But peace, she was learning, wasn't always quiet. The jukebox switched to a rowdier tune, and Jake Tanner seized the moment, his voice booming louder than the music. "You boys ever seen a sandstorm roll over Helmand Province?" he asked, slapping the bar as if to punctuate the memory. His buddies leaned in, hanging on every exaggerated detail, each story more heroic than the last. To them, Jake wasn't just telling war stories. He was performing a version of himself he desperately needed to believe in. Every boast carried an edge, a challenge, a need to prove something no one had asked him to. He spoke of firefights where he was the last man standing, of missions that had supposedly turned the tide of battles. Older veterans exchanged knowing glances. They'd heard these tales before from men trying to make the past bigger than it was, but they let him talk. They understood the bravado was armor. It wasn't the lies that bothered Sarah. It was the way his voice filled the space, leaving no room for silence. "That's the thing about service," Jake declared, raising his glass. "Real Americans prove themselves in combat. The rest just wave flags on the 4th of July. The crowd roared with approval, the kind of applause that fueled his ego. But beneath the cheers, the air in the room shifted. Some of the older men stared into their drinks, their faces hardening as if the words cut deeper than Jake intended. They knew patriotism wasn't measured in firefights or body counts. Still, they stayed silent, unwilling to start a debate they'd had 1,000 times before. Only Tom, polishing a glass behind the counter, muttered something under his breath and shook his head. Sarah sipped her beer and stared at the condensation trailing down the glass. The words weren't aimed at her, not yet, but they stung all the same. She had given more of herself than Jake could imagine, and she had done it without needing an audience. That was the difference between them. One shouted his service into the world. The other carried hers in silence. Jake's stories grew more animated, his gestures bigger, his voice bolder. He slapped his own shoulder, reenacting the recoil of an M4, laughing as he described cleaning house in enemy compounds. It was theater, and he was the star. Yet, deep down, a small part of him wondered if anyone truly believed him, or if they just enjoyed the show. One of the younger recruits nudged Jake with a grin. "What about her?" he asked, nodding toward Sarah. "Think she's seen anything close to that?" Laughter rippled through the group, low and careless. Jake turned, following their gaze, and his lips curled into a smirk. He saw an easy mark, someone to build himself up against. Sarah felt his eyes on her before he even spoke. She didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on the bottle in her hand, pretending not to notice. But inside, the quiet she had worked so hard to protect was beginning to fracture. She had come here for peace, not confrontation. Now it seemed confrontation was coming for her. Jake leaned back in his chair, his grin widening as if he were about to tell the punchline to a joke. "Probably never even been near a uniform," he said loudly, ensuring the whole bar could hear. "Bet she just likes the idea of heroes. watching from the sidelines while real Americans do the work. The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. The room's mood shifted again, this time with tension that wasn't so easily ignored. A few veterans glanced toward Sarah, their expressions caught between curiosity and discomfort. Tom wiped his hands on a towel and waited, sensing that the night was about to take a turn. And for the first time all evening, Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken. Jake rose from his stool with the swagger of a man who believed the room belonged to him. He sauntered across the floor, every step deliberate, the kind of walk meant to draw eyes. Conversations hushed slightly as he neared Sarah's table, curiosity prickling through the crowd. She didn't look up when he stopped in front of her. She just took another slow sip of beer. "Didn't catch your name," he said, leaning an elbow against the back of her chair. "But I'm guessing you're not one of us." His tone carried the kind of smug certainty that expected no challenge. Sarah set her glass down and met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm just here for a drink," she replied evenly. "Same as you," Jake chuckled, glancing over his shoulder at his friends. "A drink, huh? Well, this is a place for veterans, folks who've been in the fight. Not exactly tourist territory." The word hung in the air, tourist, meant to belittle, to diminish. A few chuckles rose from the group by the bar, but others stayed quiet, sensing something they couldn't yet name. Sarah's heartbeat slowed rather than sped up. Years of training had taught her how to remain calm under far greater pressure than this. "I respect what this place stands for," she said softly, "and the people who come here," but Jake wasn't listening. He was circling her like a predator looking for weakness, determined to draw blood. "So what's your story?" he pressed, voice dripping with mock curiosity. "You one of those people who supports the troops from a campus protest? Write papers about courage from the comfort of a classroom?" His words were sharper now, meant to provoke. Sarah's hands tightened around the glass, but her voice remained steady. "Something like that," Jake grinned, sensing victory. "See, that's the thing. Folks like you talk about sacrifice, but you've never had to make one. Never had to bleed for this country. That's why you don't get it." His words echoed through the room, each one louder than the last. "Real Americans earn their stripes. They don't just talk about them." The silence that followed wasn't agreement. It was anticipation. Tom stopped wiping glasses and watched closely, ready to step in if things went too far. A few older vets shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between the two. Sarah's calm was unsettling, too deliberate, too composed. It wasn't the reaction Jake expected, and it threw him off balance just enough to make him press harder. "So tell me," he said finally, leaning closer with a sneer, "if you're so in tune with the military life, what's your call sign?" The question was meant as a joke of final humiliation. His friends burst into laughter before she even answered, the sound grating and cruel. But Sarah didn't laugh. She didn't move. She just looked him dead in the eyes. In that moment the air in the bar seemed to thin. Something shifted, a tension that made even the jukebox feel quieter. Jake waited, expecting her to fumble, to stammer, to prove his point. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight she had carried for far too long. And though no one knew it yet, her answer would change everything. The laughter swelled again, brittle and eager, as Jake spread his arms like a ringmaster. "Come on, enlighten us," he said, voice bright with manufactured charm. "What paper did you write about courage this week, Professor?" Sarah kept her gaze steady, the beer cold against her palm. Outside, thunder rolled over the flat Texas fields like distant artillery. "You hear that?" Jake asked, tilting his head toward the storm. "Sounds like the kind of test that separates the talkers from the doers." His buddies grinned, but their eyes flicked around the room, gauging reactions. Older vets stared at the wood grain, the floor, the flag. Even bravado knows when it's brushing up against a boundary. Sarah drew a slow breath, letting the air sit in her chest. She tasted oak from the glass, salt from the rim of memory. She did not fear humiliation. She feared memory's sudden flood, not of triumph, but of faces and voices she would always carry. Silence for her had always been a discipline and a mercy. Jake mistook her quiet for retreat and pressed harder. "You respect this place? Prove it," he said, tapping the table. "Say something only a real one would know." He leaned in close enough for her to see the tremor in his jaw. Arrogance often wears the mask that insecurity hands it. Tom set a coaster by Sarah's glass and didn't move away. His presence planted a quiet line in the sand. "Jake," he said evenly, "this post has rules respects the big one." Jake's grin thinned. Pride pricked, but not punctured. He tipped his chin, pretending the warning hadn't landed. A young recruit near the bar shifted in his seat. "My uncle never talks about his tour," he murmured to no one. "Just sits quiet on Memorial Day and cleans the graves." The words fluttered into the hush like a paper flag. They landed, then disappeared beneath the rising tension. Jake tapped Sarah's beer with his knuckle, a small drum beat. "You want respect? Earn it," he said, eyes hard now. "What unit, what field, what name on the radio?" He glanced around, hunting for applause to back his courage. Applause didn't come, only the rain's insistence on the roof. Sarah's thoughts moved like a formation in the dark. Check the exits, measure the crowd, weigh the cost. Every second of silence was a door she could still close. Every heartbeat carried the past closer to this table. She had not come to open old maps in public light. "Call sign," Jake repeated, voice sharp as a snapped salute. "Say it or sit down and stop pretending." The room tightened, breath drawn and held. Somewhere a glass clinked like a spent casing on concrete. Sarah set her beer down and lifted her eyes to his. The flag over the bar stirred in the air from the doorway. Tom's hand stilled on the towel, and he waited. The storm pressed its palm to the windows, listening. Sarah felt the hinge of the night turn under her chair. She chose her next breath as carefully as a final command. She didn't speak yet. The decision had to finish forming. Not fear precision, because words once given don't return. She looked past Jake to the men who had earned silence, to the empty chairs that belonged to the ones who didn't come home. Then she nodded once, as if saluting someone only she could see. The jukebox clicked, paused, and fell quiet between songs. Jake's smile wavered in the sudden stillness. Sarah folded her hands the way she had in briefings. When she finally opened her mouth, the night leaned in. The answer arrived like dawn crossing a field. "Iron Valor," she said, and the bar forgot to breathe. The syllables moved through the room like a bell through fog. Chairs creaked as men turned without meaning to. Someone's whiskey stopped halfway to his lips and stayed there. The rain hesitated, then hammered down harder. Jake blinked, confusion scrambling for a foothold. He forced a laugh that sounded like boots slipping in mud. "Iron what?" he said, but the bravado had left his voice. Across the room a retired colonel set his glass down carefully. His hand went to his phone as if to a sidearm. Conversations collapsed into small, stunned echoes. Names, rumors, fragments of briefings flickered behind weathered eyes. "Iron Valor," someone whispered, like testing a legend for weight. Tom didn't move, didn't speak, just straightened his shoulders. The flag above him looked suddenly heavier in the dim light. The colonel stepped into the back room, door closing soft as a secret. The hum of the old refrigerator grew loud enough to hear. A younger vet swore under his breath and stood without meaning to. Another took off his cap and held it flat against his chest. Respect arrived quiet, like a formation you only notice once it's there. Jake searched the faces for permission to keep laughing. He found none, only the steady, solemn recognition of men who knew. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, no words forming ranks. The stage he had built for himself shrank to a splintered plank. He felt smaller than the stencil letters on his old duffel bag. Sarah did not gloat. She did not move. Her eyes held the horizon he couldn't see. She didn't offer proof, didn't reach for papers or names. The line between secrecy and dignity held firm in her posture. Truth didn't need trumpet or drum to be believed. The door from the back room opened, and the colonel returned. His voice, when it came, was measured and grave. "Stand easy," he said, and yet the room stood straighter. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to anymore. The weight of confirmation settled with the certainty of orders. A chair scraped. An old Marine rose and saluted. He held it just long enough to make the meaning clear. Others followed, not in unison, but in understanding. A current of gratitude moved through boots and bone. Jake felt it pass around him like a river around a stone. He tried to speak, stumbled, tried again, failed. The words he had thrown like knives lay dull at his feet. Silence answered him with the mercy he hadn't earned. Tom placed a glass of water in front of him. Nothing else. Mercy, too, has rules in a place like this. The colonel's phone buzzed once, then fell still. He gave a single nod across the room. A message delivered. No details, no stories, only the authority of what is known. Privacy stood guard where spectacle sought to break in. The room agreed to honor the line. Sarah reached for her beer, found it warm, and left it. She rose with the quiet of a flag at half-staff at sunrise. No victory in her step, only the burden of being seen. She inclined her head to the men who had stood for her. Then she turned back to Jake, not in anger, but in gravity. "You don't have to shout to prove you served," she said softly. Her voice carried further than his had all night. "Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is carry on." The storm outside began to ease, a steady tapering. Inside, a different kind of weather took hold, clearer, cooler, true. The silence that followed her words clung to the walls like smoke after gunfire. Every man in the room had been in places where silence meant danger, and that same instinct now tightened their chests. Jake stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the weight of ignorance pressing down heavier with every passing second. What he had thought was just another barroom challenge had turned into something far greater, something sacred. He felt like a trespasser in a temple he didn't know existed. Sarah remained seated, still and composed. the storm within her now calmer than the one raging outside. The name she had spoken, the one she had vowed never to say aloud again, now echoed in every corner of the room. It carried with it memories of dust and fire, of nights when death hovered so close it shared their breath. But it also carried lives, 27 of them, who had made it home because she had refused to surrender. It was not pride that kept her steady now. It was the memory of those who never got that chance. One by one, the veterans began to move. A man with trembling hands approached first, his eyes wet and shining as he nodded at her with reverence. Another followed, removing his cap and pressing it over his heart, a silent salute to the ghost of a mission he had only heard whispers about. They didn't need confirmation. The call sign was enough. Legends, after all, require no introduction. Jake tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The certainty he had wrapped himself in for so long unraveled, thread by thread, until all that remained was shame. "Are you serious?" He whispered to no one in particular, though he already knew the answer. Tom placed a steady hand on his shoulder, as if to anchor him to the moment. "Son," the old bartender said, "that woman's done more for this country than you and I combined." The colonel returned from the back room, his phone still in his hand, his face solemn. He didn't announce what he had confirmed. There was no need. Instead, he walked directly to Sarah, stopping just short of her table. When he saluted, the entire bar followed. Jake's heart hammered as he realized what kind of company he was in. No one spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. The reverence that filled the room said everything words could not. Sarah lowered her eyes, uncomfortable under the sudden weight of recognition. This was exactly what she had avoided for years. The spotlight, the questions, the reminder. And yet, deep down, a small part of her understood this silence wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. Jake finally took a step closer, his voice softer now, stripped of arrogance. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't mean—" Sarah looked at him, not with anger, but with a weary sort of understanding. "You weren't supposed to know," she said quietly. That was the point, and with that she turned back to her half-finished beer. The colonel spoke then, his voice carrying the authority of 1,000 salutes. "Some warriors don't come home with medals. Some don't come home at all. And some," he said, looking at Sarah, "carry the war with them every single day." His words cut deeper than any reprimand Jake had ever received. They weren't meant to humiliate. They were meant to teach. And they did. A ripple of murmurs moved through the room as the veterans returned to their seats. But the mood had changed, lighter for some, heavier for others. They had come here tonight to drink and swap stories. Instead, they had been reminded of the quiet price of freedom, and no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Outside, the rain began to fade, replaced by the slow drip of water from the eaves. Inside, something else had shifted, something lasting. The story of iron valor would not stay within these walls for long, but for now it belonged to those who had heard it with their own ears. And in that room, silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was respect made real. The story of iron valor spread quickly, as stories like that always do. It started as a whisper, passed from one veteran to another, from one bar stool to the next. By the end of the night, it was a name spoken with awe and reverence, like a prayer. Even those who had never heard of the mission knew instinctively that it was something extraordinary, For them, the mystery was part of the legend. Jake sat alone at the far end of the bar, staring into the depths of a glass he hadn't touched. The swagger that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow weight in his chest. He felt small, smaller than he had in years, and the silence of those around him only made it worse. But beneath the shame was something else, the faint spark of understanding. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about perspective. Tom moved quietly behind the counter, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing. He glanced at Jake, but didn't offer advice, wisdom he knew was something a man had to come to on his own. Instead, he placed a glass of water next to the untouched beer and walked away. It was a small gesture, but in a place like this, small gestures spoke volumes. Jake understood it for what it was, a chance to start over. Meanwhile, in a booth near the back, 2 older soldiers swapped fragments of memory. "Iron Valor," one said, shaking his head. "I thought that was a myth." "Not a myth," the other replied quietly. "A miracle." Their voices carried just far enough for Jake to hear, each word carving deeper into the shell of his pride. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't resent the lesson. Sarah hadn't moved from her seat since the revelation. She sat quietly, listening to the hum of conversations she had no part in. This wasn't the kind of attention she wanted, but it was the one she had earned. Still, a part of her wished the night had gone differently, that her past had stayed buried where it belonged. But maybe she thought it was time to stop running from it. Her thoughts drifted back to Afghanistan, the screaming winds, the dust-choked air, the relentless sound of gunfire. She remembered the weight of the radio in her hand, the faces of the men depending on her voice. 17 hours of chaos and impossible decisions, and in the end, 27 lives still breathing. She had never thought of herself as a hero. She still didn't. The colonel approached her again, slower this time, his posture less formal. "Some stories deserve to be told," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even if they're painful." Sarah smiled faintly but shook her head. "Some stories are meant to be lived," she replied. "Not shared." The door swung open, letting in a gust of cool night air and the distant sound of rain on asphalt. The colonel glanced toward the noise and then back at her. "Either way," he said, "the people in this room won't forget tonight." Sarah knew he was right, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to live with that. At the bar, Jake finally rose from his stool and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if he had the right to get closer. "Ma'am," he began, the word foreign on his tongue. "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since she'd spoken her call sign. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just learn from it." When he nodded, it wasn't out of obligation, but understanding. And in that moment, the story of the loud Marine and the silent soldier stopped being one of conflict. It became something else entirely, a story of humility, redemption, and the quiet strength of those who serve without seeking praise. The legend of Iron Valor had been revealed, but the lessons it carried were only just beginning. Jake lingered near the jukebox long after most of the others had left. The glow of the neon flag reflected in the untouched drink before him. The weight of his words, all the arrogance, the mockery, the ignorance, pressed down like a rucksack he could no longer shrug off. He replayed every second of the night in his mind, each laugh and jeer now sounding crueler than it had in the moment. Shame was a new uniform, and it fit tighter than any he'd worn before. For the first time in years, he felt small enough to listen. Sarah hadn't spoken to him again, but she didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of reckoning, more powerful than anger could ever be. Every nod, every salute from the veterans around him told Jake the same thing. He had been standing in the presence of something greater than himself. It wasn't just that she had saved lives, it was that she had done it quietly and carried that weight alone. The realization made his bravado taste like ash. Tom poured a final round before closing, sliding a glass of water toward Jake instead of whiskey. "You'll feel worse in the morning," he said, not unkindly. "And that's a good thing." Jake managed a weak smile. "I deserve worse than a hangover." "Maybe," Tom said, "but the lesson's already doing its work." The bartender walked away, leaving Jake to stew in a silence that no story could fill. When Sarah stood to leave, Jake rose instinctively, as if pulled by a force he didn't fully understand. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. In the end, he only managed, "Thank you." Sarah paused, glanced back at him, and gave a single nod. Not forgiveness, not approval, but acknowledgment. For Jake, that was more than he had earned. The following morning, Post 142 was buzzing with whispers before noon. The story of Iron Valor, once a classified legend, had spread beyond the bar like wildfire, but the veterans treated it with the same reverence they had shown the night before, careful not to turn it into spectacle. They spoke of Sarah not as a hero, but as a reminder of what service truly meant. And for Jake, every whispered word was a mirror reflecting the man he wanted to become. He visited the bar again that evening, but this time he didn't talk. He listened, really listened, to the older men sharing stories that weren't inflated or dramatized. Stories of fear, mistakes, regret, and love for the men beside them. It was the first time Jake understood that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, patient, and far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. When Sarah arrived later that night, the room shifted again. Not with tension this time, but with deep respect, the kind that doesn't require applause. Jake stood when she entered, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. She didn't look at him, and she didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to remind him of the kind of man he still had time to become. Tom leaned against the bar, polishing a glass and watching Jake closely. "You look different," he said with a faint smile. "Feels different," Jake admitted. "Feels heavier." "That's not a bad thing," Tom replied. "Means you're starting to understand." And for the first time since leaving the Corps, Jake felt like he might. The jukebox hummed softly as the night wore on, its melodies weaving through the conversations that filled the room. Jake said little, but his silence now felt different, deliberate, respectful, earned. And though he didn't know it yet, this night was the beginning of a transformation. The man who had mocked sacrifice was learning to honor it, and the woman who had spent years hiding from her past was helping him do it without saying another word. The hum of an idling government SUV outside broke the quiet the next afternoon. Two men in suits stepped through the door of Post 142, scanning the room with practiced eyes before locking on to Sarah. Conversations tapered off into silence. Everyone recognized a type, even if they didn't wear uniforms. "Ma'am," one said, showing credentials. "We need a word. It wasn't a request." Sarah followed them to a back table where Tom set down 3 cups of coffee without being asked. The agents didn't touch theirs. "We're here to make sure nothing classified was disclosed," the taller one said. "It wasn't," Sarah replied flatly. "I was careful." The man nodded. "We know. But protocol requires a statement." Her lips twitched, the familiar dance of red tape and secrecy. Jake watched from across the room, guilt swirling in his chest. This was his fault, his ego, his ignorance, his need to prove something. Now she was being interrogated for doing nothing more than speaking the truth. The realization twisted inside him, deeper and sharper than before. He wished he could take every word back. The conversation lasted 15 minutes. No accusations, no reprimands, just formalities and reminders of the oath she had once sworn. When it was done, the men thanked her for her service and left as quietly as they had arrived. The room exhaled and conversation slowly resumed. But for Jake, the weight of his actions hadn't lifted. He approached Sarah as she returned to her seat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Trouble's part of the job." There was no anger in her voice, only a tired acceptance. "But next time," she added, "think before you speak." Her words hit harder than any insult could have. Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I will," he promised. Tom clapped a hand on his shoulder as he passed. "That's growth, son," he said. "Don't waste it." Jake watched as Sarah picked up a book from her bag and began reading, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. The veterans returned to their drinks and conversations, but something in the air was different now. The story of Iron Valor had shifted from legend to living memory. It was no longer just about the mission. It was about humility, silence, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Jake had learned more about service in 2 days than he had in 2 tours. And this time he didn't need to talk about it to prove it. By closing time, the rain had returned, drumming gently on the tin roof as the last few patrons trickled out. Jake lingered by the door, watching the water streak down the windows. Sarah passed him on her way out, pausing just long enough to offer a nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something better, a chance. And Jake Tanner intended to earn it. The bar was quieter now, days removed from the storm that had changed everything. The regulars still gathered beneath the faded flags, still swapped stories over whiskey and barbecue, but the air felt different, deeper, somehow. And in a back corner booth, Jake Tanner and Sarah Whitaker sat across from each other, the hum of the jukebox filling the space between their words. For the first time, Jake wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just trying to understand. "I used to think service was about being the toughest," Jake said, staring into his glass. "The loudest guy in the room, the one with the most stories. I thought that's what made you matter." Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression calm and unreadable. "And now?" she asked gently. Jake sighed. "Now, I think it's about what you're willing to do when no one's watching." Sarah's eyes softened just slightly. "That's closer to the truth," she said. "Service isn't a performance. It's not about medals or titles or how many people know your name." She leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the flag hanging above the bar. "It's about what you're willing to give even when it costs you everything." Jake nodded slowly, her words settling deep in his chest. He swallowed hard before speaking again. When I left the Marines, I felt empty, like the best part of me stayed overseas. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, his voice breaking just slightly. So I built this version of myself, the loud one, the fearless one, because I thought that's what people respected. Sarah tilted her head. And did they? Jake shook his head. No, they just tolerated me. And deep down I hated myself for it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I know that emptiness, Sarah said finally. It doesn't go away overnight. Her eyes seemed to look past him, toward a place far away and long ago. I carried it too, still do some days, the guilt, the nightmares, the faces. She pressed her hands together, steadying herself. We all pay for the things we survive. Some of us pay for them the rest of our lives. Jake's throat tightened. How do you live with that? You don't, she said simply. You learn to carry it differently. She glanced around the bar, at the veterans laughing softly over beers, at Tom cleaning glasses behind the counter. You find purpose in helping others carry theirs. You remind them they're not broken. And you remind yourself you're not either. Jake stared at her, the weight of her words hitting harder than any lesson he'd ever received in uniform. Maybe that's what I've been missing, he murmured. Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on his forearm, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Your duty doesn't end when you hang up the uniform, she said. It just changes. Jake nodded, the truth of it settling into the empty spaces inside him. For the first time since leaving the corps, he didn't feel like he was failing. For the first time, he felt like maybe he could serve again, just in a different way. The jukebox shifted to a slow, soulful country ballad, and for a long while they just sat in silence. There were no dramatic speeches, no grand revelations, just two soldiers, separated by experience, but united by scars. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not redemption, not yet, but the beginning of it. The kind that takes root slowly like the first green shoots after a long, hard winter. The night stretched on, and as the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself staring into a glass of bourbon she hadn't touched. The conversation with Jake had stirred things she'd tried hard to bury, memories sealed behind mental doors she rarely dared open. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, the doors began to creak. And once they did, the memories poured out, not in flashbacks or nightmares, but in words. I don't talk about it, she said quietly, not looking at him. Not because I can't, because I shouldn't. Jake listened, saying nothing, sensing this was something sacred. There were 19 of us, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Outnumbered 5-1. No air support. No extraction window. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. We were told to hold the line. So we did. Every word seemed to drag a weight with it. She stared into the distance, seeing not the wood-paneled walls of Post 142, but the jagged mountains of Afghanistan. I remember the smell of burning diesel and wet sand. I remember shouting over gunfire so loud it drowned out my thoughts. Her voice faltered. I remember the faces of men who asked if they were going to die, and I had to lie. Jake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it hard to breathe. They didn't, she added softly. Not one of them. Her silence after that was heavier than any detail she could have shared. I see them in my dreams sometimes, she admitted. The ones I saved. The ones I couldn't. The ones who saved me. Jake wanted to say something, anything, but there was nothing to say, because nothing he could say would ever be enough. The weight of her sacrifice was beyond words. That's why I don't talk about it, she said finally. Because once you start, you don't stop. And once you remember, you don't forget. She exhaled slowly, as if letting go of air she'd been holding for years. It's easier to carry it in silence. Easier to let the world believe you're just another face in the crowd. Jake shook his head. But you're not. No, she said. I'm not. And that's the hardest part. Tom approached with 2 glasses of water, setting them gently on the table without a word. He had seen this before, not the details, but the aftermath. The confessions that slip out in dim light when walls finally crack. War doesn't end when the shooting stops, he said quietly. It just changes shape. Sarah nodded. And sometimes it follows you home. Jake leaned forward, his voice steadier than before. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. She let out a bitter laugh. Strength isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's just what's left. But there was something in his words that lingered, a small flicker of validation she hadn't realized she needed. For years, she had defined herself by what she had endured. Now, for the first time, someone saw the strength in how she had survived. The room was nearly empty now, the jukebox playing softly to no one in particular. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the pavement shining under the glow of a streetlight. Inside, 2 veterans sat in the quiet, each carrying scars the other could now see. They were not healed. They might never be, but for the first time they were not carrying them alone. The following week, Post 142 felt a little different. The flags still hung from the walls, the jukebox still hummed old country songs, and the smell of bourbon and barbecue still clung to the air. But there was something deeper now, a sense of reverence, of perspective, of gratitude. It wasn't just a place to remember battles anymore. It was a place to remember why they were fought. Sarah stood by the bar, speaking to a small group of younger veterans, men and women barely older than she had been when she first put on the uniform. They listened closely, not because she told war stories, but because she spoke truth. Patriotism isn't loud, she said, her voice calm and steady. It's not waving a flag just to be seen or shouting the loudest in a room. She looked around, meeting each of their eyes in turn. It's sacrifice. It's responsibility. It's showing up when no one else will. The room had never been quieter. It's the father who works 3 jobs so his kids never have to know hunger, she continued. It's the medic who saves lives and never once talks about it. It's the mom who folds a flag into a shadow box and still stands, proud when the anthem plays. Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from a place deep within her, shaped by years of pain, duty, and reflection. Patriotism isn't something you wear, she said softly. It's something you live. A single nod from an older veteran in the corner told her the message had landed. Jake stood near the back, listening quietly. He had heard speeches about service before, at boot camp graduations, at Memorial Day events, at funerals. But none of them had hit him the way this did. It was simple, unpolished, and honest, a truth stripped of pageantry. And for the first time in his life he understood that patriotism wasn't about proving you're worthy of America. It was about being worthy of those who gave everything for it. After the talk, Jake approached Sarah with a question he never thought he'd ask. "How do I live that?" He said, "What does that look like for someone like me?" She smiled faintly. "It looks like showing up. It looks like serving again, not with a weapon, but with your hands, your time, your heart." Her words settled into him like marching orders. And for the first time since leaving the Marines, he felt like he had a mission again. The veterans gathered around Sarah, some shaking her hand, some offering quiet thanks. She accepted it all with grace, but no pride. This wasn't about her. It was about the message. It was about rewriting what service meant to those who had forgotten. And it was about making sure they never forgot again. Later that night, Jake walked home under a sky littered with stars, his breath visible in the cool Texas air. The word patriotism echoed in his mind with a new weight. It was no longer about combat or glory. It was about purpose, and he was determined to live with purpose again. Starting tomorrow. 3 weeks later, the man who once mocked sacrifice was now volunteering 3 nights a week at the local Veterans Reintegration Center. Jake swept floors, organized supplies, helped coordinate job programs. Anything they needed, he did. But more than that, he listened. He sat with men and women haunted by the same emptiness that had once consumed him, and shared what Sarah had taught him. "Your story isn't over," he would say. "You're not done serving." It wasn't just advice. It was a lifeline. The first time Sarah visited the center and saw him there, she smiled. Not the polite, distant smile she often wore, but a genuine one, small and warm. "You took my words seriously," she said. Jake shrugged. They were too important not to. For the first time, the tension between them was gone. In its place was something stronger, respect. Their unlikely friendship grew into a mentorship that neither had expected. Sarah guided Jake with quiet wisdom, and Jake brought an energy and optimism that reminded her why she had fought in the first place. Together they helped veterans navigate the messy, difficult transition back into civilian life. They organized workshops, support groups, and events, small victories that rippled outward. And every time a struggling veteran found their footing, they both felt the weight they carried grow a little lighter. Tom visited the center one evening, watching the two of them work. "Never thought I'd see this," he said with a chuckle. "You two make a hell of a team," Sarah smiled. "I guess redemption takes teamwork." Jake laughed softly. "Guess so." It was true. Neither could have done this alone. And maybe that was the point. Their work didn't erase the past. It transformed it. The humiliation, the silence, the pain, it all became fuel for something bigger. Jake found a new purpose in helping others, and Sarah found healing in sharing her strength. And together they turned a night of conflict into a mission of hope, one that was changing lives far beyond the walls of Post 142. On the wall of the center hung a framed photo, a folded flag, a pair of combat boots, and a single line beneath them. "Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." It became their motto, their guiding principle, their reason to keep going. Every time Jake looked at it, he felt grounded. Every time Sarah saw it, she felt free. Their story spread quietly, just like the story of Iron Valor had. But this time it wasn't a legend born from war. It was one born from what came after, from humility, from mentorship, from second chances. And every veteran who walked through those doors carried a piece of that story with them. A story that started with mockery and ended with meaning. Back at post 142, the whispers about Iron Valor hadn't faded, but they had evolved. Now, when new recruits bragged too loudly or veterans measured their worth by old battles, someone would nod toward the reintegration center. "Talk to Jake Tanner," they'd say. "He'll show you what service looks like." And every time Jake heard those words, he thought of the woman who had changed everything, the woman who had taught him that real strength was never loud. The day of Sarah's graduation dawned bright and crisp. The Texas sky, a perfect blue, stretched wide above the university courtyard. She stood among a sea of caps and gowns, her posture straight and composed, the medal she never wore resting in a drawer miles away. Today wasn't about what she had done in the past. It was about what she was choosing to do next. Her degree in political science wasn't a prize. It was a tool she planned to use for the people who had once fought beside her. After the ceremony, a small crowd gathered outside the auditorium. Professors, classmates, veterans she had helped along the way. Tom was there, leaning against a railing with a proud smile, and Jake stood beside him, his hands in his pockets and a glint of purpose in his eyes. "You did it," he said when she approached. "Didn't think you'd let me have the last word." Sarah chuckled softly. "I was never much for speeches anyway," but her eyes shone with something deeper, peace. Weeks turned into months, and Sarah's mission evolved into something bigger than she had ever imagined. She accepted a position with a national organization focused on veterans' reintegration, helping design programs that address the invisible wounds of war, workshops on trauma, scholarships for service members transitioning to civilian careers, legislative initiatives to improve mental health care. It was the same fight she had been waging quietly for years, only now the battlefield had changed. And for once the war felt winnable. Post 142 became more than just a watering hole for old soldiers. It transformed into a gathering place for purpose, part community center, part refuge, part launching pad for new lives. Veterans came not just to reminisce, but to rebuild. Some found jobs, some found healing, some simply found a place where silence no longer felt heavy. And at the heart of it all was the story that had started with a single name. The legend of Iron Valor lived on, but not in the way legends usually do. There were no parades, no documentaries, no speeches carved into marble. It lived in the quiet nods exchanged between strangers who shared a burden. It lived in the gentle hand placed on a trembling shoulder during a bad day. It lived in the unspoken understanding that service, true service, never ends. New recruits who wandered into post 142 often came with the same swagger Jake once wore like a second skin. They'd tell stories too loudly, wear their pride too high, and talk too much about proving themselves. And every time, without fail, one of the older veterans would offer a small smile and say the same thing. "Careful who you're talking to." The words always landed like a lesson, one that every soldier needed to learn. Jake had changed more than anyone thought possible. He was now the first to welcome new veterans into the center, the first to offer a hand, the first to listen without judgment. His story, once one of arrogance and ignorance, had become one of redemption and purpose. And he never forgot where it started, with a quiet woman who had carried the weight of a war without ever needing to prove she fought it. To him, Sarah wasn't just Iron Valor. She was the reason he'd found his way back. One evening, months later, Sarah returned to the bar long after closing. The lights were dim, the jukebox silent, the smell of wood and whiskey lingering in the stillness. She stood in front of the flag that hung above the bar, the same one that had watched over countless nights of laughter and pain. "I hope we made a difference," she whispered into the empty room. Somehow she knew they had. Before she left, Tom handed her an envelope, unmarked, sealed, with no return address. Inside was a simple note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "We still remember, and we still owe you one." There was no signature, but she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was from, and for the first time the past didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like a chapter, one she had finally closed. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the neon flag sign above the door flickered to life, casting a soft glow on the rain-damp street. The war was behind her, but the mission, the real mission, was just beginning. She walked away from Post 142 not as Iron Valor, not as the woman who had saved 27 lives, but as Sarah Whitaker, veteran, scholar, mentor, and advocate. The fight for freedom had forged her. The fight for healing would define her. And somewhere out there, someone else's story was just beginning, because of hers. Have you or someone you love ever had to prove people wrong because of prejudice? Tell us in the comments.